Peterson built a multi-million-dollar empire by positioning himself as the fearless truth-teller who destroys his opponents with facts and logic. But when faced with actual intellectuals asking basic questions, we get to see what Peterson really is, a grandiose narcissist whose entire worldview is designed to maintain his self-image as a profound genius while avoiding any position that might cost him money. Watch as the man who tells others to clean their rooms reveals that his own intellectual house is built on absolute quicksand.
I think there are a number of questions which Professor Dawkins has asked quite directly that we still haven't really heard an answer for.
Okay.
When Professor Dawkins asking about the virgin birth, you started talking about metaphor, you started talking about myth. I think anybody listening to this conversation will understand that maybe a society that doesn't believe in the virgin birth won't work. Maybe that's the predictive power that you're talking about. But I think you must understand that when Professor Dawkins is asking you, do you believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? He means something like a biological fact. And by the way, saying I don't know, or saying, I'm not qualified to comment, is an answer to that question. But is that your answer, that you don't know?
I said earlier, and I would hold to this, is that there are elements of the text that I don't know how to, that I'm incapable of fully accounting for.
Here's what's really happening. Peterson has built a massive financial empire: books, speaking tours, online courses, Patreon subscriptions, by marketing himself to two completely different audiences who hate each other. On one side, he's got Christian conservatives who think he's defending biblical values. On the other side, he's got secular intellectuals who think he's too smart to believe in fairy tales. The moment he gives a straight answer about the virgin birth, he loses half his income. So instead of intellectual honesty, we get this pathetic performance where Peterson pretends the question is too complex for his giant brain to process. This is a man who regularly pontificates about quantum mechanics, evolutionary psychology, and geopolitics with absolute confidence, but suddenly becomes intellectually humble when asked if he believes a woman got pregnant without sex. It's not intellectual sophistication, it's financial calculation disguised as profundity. The beautiful irony is that Peterson built his brand on attacking people who refuse to speak clearly and precisely. Remember his whole crusade against pronoun usage? He demanded that everyone else use language with crystal clarity, but when it comes to his own beliefs, suddenly everything becomes mysterious and incomprehensible.
I can't account for what the fundamental reality and significance of the notion of the resurrection is. My knowledge just ends.
Notice how he immediately pivots to talking about his inability to account for the significance of the resurrection, which wasn't even the question being asked. This is Peterson's signature move. When confronted with a simple question that would force him to take a clear position, he retreats into abstract philosophical rambling that makes him sound deep while saying absolutely nothing. The moderator just explained that Dawkins is asking about biological facts, not metaphorical significance or cultural impact. Did a woman conceive a child without sexual intercourse? It's a yes or no question. But Peterson can't say no because that would alienate his Christian audience, and he can't say yes because that would make him look ridiculous to his intellectual audience. So instead he pretends the question is somehow beneath his sophisticated understanding, which is the most pathetic cop-out imaginable.
Sure, but
I know that whatever happened as a consequence of the origination and the promotion of the Christian story was powerful enough to bring Rome to its knees and demolish the pagan enterprise.
This is Peterson's standard move when cornered: redirect to something that sounds impressive but is completely irrelevant. Notice he's not talking about whether the story is true, just whether it's powerful. This is the intellectual equivalent of a used car salesman pivoting to the car's paint job when you ask about the engine problems. Peterson has convinced himself that this evasiveness makes him profound rather than cowardly. In his mind, he's not avoiding the question, he's operating on such a sophisticated intellectual level that simple yes or no questions are beneath him. This is classic narcissistic grandiosity. Rather than admit he's being evasive to protect his income streams, he's convinced himself that his evasiveness proves his intellectual superiority.
So there's some power in that story that's remarkable.
Let's stick to the virgin birth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the virgin birth results from a mistranslation of Isaiah. You know that.
Like these sorts of questions, what would you say? They don't strike me as, they're not getting to the point.
Dawkins points out that the virgin birth story likely comes from a mistranslation, which is actually a scholarly response to the question. But Peterson dismisses this as not getting to the point, even though it directly addresses the historical origins of the belief he's being asked about. Peterson wants to talk about everything except the actual content of Christian claims because he knows they're indefensible on factual grounds.
I know
The story has a purpose.
Yes.
Well, and look, I understand that there's perfect reasons to debate this. I know that, and I know that your question is more than valid, but it's beside the issue as far as I'm concerned. And it's partly because, well, when we started this conversation, I said, for example, that it appears to be the case that a description of the structure through which we see the world is a story. We see the world through a story. And so that's a remarkable thing. That's a remarkable discovery.
Look at this language. Peterson presents basic insights about human psychology as if he personally discovered them. Humans understand the world through narratives. Wow, Jordan, what a revelation. It's not like philosophers, psychologists, and anthropologists have been discussing this for centuries. But in Peterson's mind, he's not just repeating well-known ideas, he's making remarkable discoveries that lesser minds can't comprehend. This is the core of Peterson's psychological appeal to his audience. He takes relatively simple concepts that most educated people already know, wraps them in pseudo-profound language, and presents them as earth-shattering insights. His followers get to feel like they're accessing secret knowledge that makes them intellectually superior to everyone else. It's self-help disguised as philosophy, marketed to people desperate to feel smarter than they are. But here's what's really pathological about Peterson's performance. He genuinely seems to believe his own hype. This isn't just cynical marketing. Peterson has convinced himself that his ability to avoid answering simple questions represents intellectual depth rather than intellectual cowardice. He's created a psychological defense mechanism that protects both his income and his grandiose self-image simultaneously.
And it's emerged probably in the last 60 years in multiple disciplines, because we have to prioritize our facts. And so we prioritize them according to a particular pattern. And there are patterns that seem to work and to propagate themselves properly and to orient cultures towards life abundant. And there are other patterns, the pattern of Cain, for example, that lead to absolute bloody devastation. And I don't know exactly how to construe that sort of truth. But we talked about the oppression of women, for example. It's like, how do you make a case on purely factual grounds that women should be treated as equals?
It's a moral question, and
I know that's exactly.
I was dealing with a factual question, which is, did Jesus have a father? And you won't answer it.
Well,
It's a
Jesus
different
had an
kind of
earthly
question.
father and a heavenly father, like almost all mythological heroes.
So he wasn't born of a virgin then? So you're saying that Jesus was not born of a virgin?
I said, first of all, that I don't know how to mediate the fact-value dichotomy in that case. I said the same thing about the resurrection.
It's not a value, it's a simple fact.
Peterson is trying to turn a factual question into a discussion about cultural patterns and values, but whether Mary had sexual intercourse is a biological fact, not a value judgment. Either she did or she didn't. Either Jesus had a biological father or he didn't. These aren't complex philosophical questions. They're simple empirical claims that either correspond to reality or they don't. Peterson's response reveals his fundamental intellectual bankruptcy. He's built his entire career on criticizing postmodern relativism and insisting on the importance of truth and precision, but when asked to apply those standards to his own beliefs, he immediately retreats into exactly the kind of relativistic word games he claims to oppose.
I mean, did a man have intercourse with Mary and produce Jesus? That's a factual question. It's not a value question.
You must understand what you're being asked here, that even if you think that, say, the author of the biblical texts intended much more significance than a simple scientific analysis of events, Professor Dawkins is interested in scientific truth. That's the kind of truth that he's interested in. And even if you think it's irrelevant to the point of what the gospel authors were getting at, that first needs to be clarified before you can then begin actually uncovering what the stories are about. So I think Professor Dawkins is asking from a scientific perspective, and maybe you think that that scientific approach is wrong, but if you just take it for a moment, maybe this is how we find out that it is wrong. Let's take a scientific approach. Ask the question, did this occur?
I think that it's inappropriate to use a question like that to attempt to undermine the validity of the entire, what would you say, deep mythological enterprise.
Notice what this reveals about Peterson's actual relationship to Christianity. He doesn't defend the virgin birth as true, he defends it as useful. He's not a Christian believer, he's a Christian utilitarian. He thinks religious stories should be preserved not because they accurately describe reality, but because they serve social and psychological functions. This is exactly the kind of cynical manipulation that actual religious believers should find offensive. The deeper issue is that Peterson has constructed his entire identity around being the defender of Western civilization against postmodern nihilism. But when pressed on what he actually believes about Western civilization's foundational stories, he retreats into exactly the kind of postmodern relativism he claims to oppose. The virgin birth isn't true or false, it's methodologically significant. Religious claims aren't about facts, they're about values. This is pure postmodernism with conservative political conclusions.
Suppose we weren't doing that. Suppose we were asking out of interest. Suppose that we were all here devout Christians, maybe even Jungian Christians, and we thought, this is interesting, over dinner. Do you think it really happened, like scientifically? Would your answer just be, I don't know?
Yes.
This exchange is devastating for Peterson because it exposes his paranoid mindset and intellectual cowardice simultaneously. First, he assumes that asking factual questions about Christian claims is an attack designed to undermine religion entirely. This reveals someone who knows his position is indefensible and can only survive by avoiding scrutiny. If your beliefs are strong, you should welcome questions, not treat them as hostile undermining. Second, the moderator brilliantly reframes the question in the most charitable possible way. Imagine we're all Christians just having a friendly discussion over dinner. Even in that context, Peterson can't give a straight answer. When the moderator suggests he would simply say, I don't know, Peterson agrees, which raises the obvious question, why is it so hard to say that publicly? The answer is because Peterson's entire brand depends on appearing to be a defender of Western civilization and Christian values, but he can't actually defend them because he doesn't really believe them.
And you wouldn't consider it, it's not an inappropriate question to ask, just on a point of interest.
Right.
Did this really occur? And I think so often people are asking you that, and especially given the context of this conversation, we've heard everything that you're saying about metaphor and myth, but because the question is still then being asked, did it really happen? You know that that's what you're being asked. And the way you just so easily said yes, I wonder why you struggle to do that in so many other circumstances.
I think because I don't look at the situation the same. The way that Dr. Dawkins and I look at the situation are really quite different and at many, many, many levels.
Peterson is essentially saying that he and Dawkins are operating from such different frameworks that communication is impossible, which is nonsense. Dawkins is asking whether Peterson believes certain historical events actually occurred. This isn't some deep philosophical disagreement about epistemology, it's a straightforward question about empirical claims. Peterson's response reveals that he knows his position is indefensible, so instead of defending it, he tries to make the conversation itself impossible by claiming incommensurable worldviews. This is exactly the kind of postmodern relativistic move that Peterson supposedly opposes when it comes from the left, but he deploys it immediately when his own beliefs are challenged.
So even on the meme question, for example, I know the literature on the history of religious ideas. I see how these ideas have battled across millennia in a manner that is very reminiscent to me of the same sort of claim that Dr. Dawkins is putting forward with regards to meme. I know that literature. Dr. Dawkins doesn't know that literature. And it's very difficult for me to communicate from within the confines of that literature because it's extensive and deep.
This is Peterson at his most insecure and desperate. When he can't answer a simple question, he retreats into claims about his superior knowledge and expertise. But notice that he doesn't actually cite any specific works, scholars, or arguments. He just asserts that he knows more than Dawkins and therefore doesn't need to engage with the question being asked. This reveals something crucial about Peterson's psychological makeup. His entire self-concept depends on being the smartest person in the room, the one who sees deeper patterns that others miss. When confronted with someone like Dawkins who clearly knows about the specific topics being discussed, Peterson can't handle the threat to his grandiose self-image. So he retreats into vague claims about his vast knowledge that conveniently can't be tested or verified in the moment. But here's the really pathetic part. Peterson regularly ventures into fields where he has no expertise and makes confident pronouncements about economics, climate science, political theory, and evolutionary biology. He never seems to worry about his lack of specialized knowledge in those areas. But when asked about his own religious beliefs, suddenly expertise becomes crucial and the questions become unanswerable without years of background study. This double standard reveals that Peterson's appeals to expertise are just rhetorical weapons used to avoid accountability. When he wants to make bold claims, expertise doesn't matter. When he's asked to defend those claims, suddenly only experts can understand the issues involved.
And we're dealing with things that we don't understand the relationship between metaphoric truth and value-predicated truth and factual truth. We don't understand that. It's a big problem. There's no evidence whatsoever from the scientific perspective that we can orient ourselves in the world merely in consequence of the facts.
Sure.
And that's a fact. And it's a fact that's been detailed out in great detail in the last 60 years by people from a variety of different disciplines. We have to prioritize the facts. That's a value hierarchy.
Here Peterson attempts his most sophisticated evasion by raising genuine philosophical questions about the relationship between facts and values. This is actually an interesting topic. How do we decide which facts to investigate, and don't those decisions involve value judgments that can't themselves be scientifically validated? But Peterson is using this legitimate philosophical complexity to avoid answering a simple factual question. Whether Jesus was born of a virgin is not a question about value hierarchies or how we prioritize facts for investigation. It's a straightforward empirical claim about what happened in history. Either a specific woman conceived a child without sexual intercourse, or she didn't. That's not a value judgment, it's a claim about biological processes. Peterson's move here is intellectually dishonest because he's trying to dissolve a factual question into epistemological complexity. It's like being asked whether you believe in unicorns and responding with a lecture about the philosophy of science. Technically sophisticated, but completely irrelevant to the actual question.
There may be true and false ways of prioritizing facts, but you can't determine the truth or falsehood of the way that you prioritize facts by making reference to the facts. That's a big problem.
Okay, let's talk about that as perhaps a slight detour here, because I think we do need to come back to this Christ resurrection thing. But Professor Dawkins, would you say that underlying the scientific enterprise is a fundamentally unscientific assumption? You can make scientific investigations in the world, but in order to do so, you need to choose what to prioritize. You need to choose what to investigate. You also need to value the truth. You need to have a value and a motivation for doing it in the first place. Those kinds of things cannot themselves be scientifically justified. And so does the scientific enterprise have an unscientific assumption of space?
I suppose it does. I mean, I think that maybe just be Jordan and Richard, by the way. I think that Jordan prioritizes myth and I prioritize fact. And I think myth is kind of vaguely interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. I think it's somewhat secondary to scientific fact, the sort of facts that tell us how old the universe is, how old the world is, the history of life, the engineering achievements of landing a spacecraft on a comet. These are the things that science can do. And as I said, the predictions of quantum theory, to come back to that, the predictions of quantum theory, which are verified to a sufficient number of decimal places that it's equivalent to predicting the width of North America to one hair's breadth. Now, that is, however difficult quantum theory is to understand, that is what you can get from quantum theory. Now, the mysteries of the Bible, if they are mysteries, aren't in the same league. I mean, they just don't cut it.
See well, okay, so let me respond to that. So one of the things that I've tried to study is the preconditions for the scientific enterprise itself. you appeared to agree with Alex that there might be presumptions, axioms that need to be accepted. I don't want to put words in your mouth because I want to get this right before the scientific enterprise can begin. So I've tried to think those through. So let me lay out a couple of them. This is partly what I've done while trying to make the case, for example, that you're more of a Christian than you think you are. So, for example, I think that the scientific enterprise is motivated by the axiomatic presumption that truth tends towards a unity. I think that it's predicated on the notion that there is a logical order that's intrinsic to the cosmos, that fundamental order is good, that it's intelligible to human beings.
This argument reveals both Peterson's historical ignorance and his desperate need to make himself relevant to conversations about science. The idea that scientific thinking depends on uniquely Christian assumptions is historically illiterate nonsense. Greek philosophers, Islamic scholars, Hindu mathematicians, and Chinese astronomers all developed sophisticated methods for investigating the natural world long before Christianity existed or in cultures where Christianity had no influence. But Peterson needs to make this argument because his entire brand depends on claiming that secular intellectuals like Dawkins are secretly dependent on the Christian tradition that Peterson supposedly represents. It's a way of maintaining his grandiose self-image as the keeper of Western civilization's deepest wisdom while avoiding any commitment to Christianity's actual supernatural claims.
And that discovering that order and aligning ourselves with it makes for life more abundant.
This is Peterson's most desperate move, trying to claim that science itself depends on Christian assumptions. This argument is historically illiterate and philosophically confused. First, the idea that truth tends toward unity, that the cosmos has logical order, and that this order is intelligible to humans are not uniquely Christian ideas. These concepts appear in Greek philosophy, Islamic philosophy, Hindu philosophy, and pretty much every intellectual tradition that has ever existed. Second, even if Christianity historically contributed to the development of science in Europe, that tells us nothing about whether Christian supernatural claims are true. You can believe that the universe is rationally ordered without believing that a virgin gave birth to the Son of God. The logical structure Peterson is describing is compatible with deism, pantheism, naturalism, or dozens of other worldviews.
I think that the scientific enterprise is also predicated on the idea that the truth will set you free. And I think all of those axioms are religious and derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And if you don't believe that, you have to account for why science emerged in Europe and nowhere else in the entire history of humanity, for example.
This claim is factually wrong and reveals Peterson's stunning ignorance of the history of science. Science didn't emerge only in Europe. Islamic scholars preserved and extended Greek natural philosophy during the European Dark Ages. Chinese scholars developed printing, gunpowder, and sophisticated astronomical observations. Indian mathematicians developed key concepts in algebra and arithmetic. Peterson's claim that science emerged nowhere else in the entire history of humanity is the kind of Eurocentric nonsense that actual historians abandoned decades ago. But Peterson either doesn't know this or doesn't care, because the truth would interfere with his narrative about Christianity's unique contribution to human progress. This is particularly revealing because Peterson constantly positions himself as someone who respects facts over ideology. But when facts contradict his preferred narrative, he simply ignores them or makes up alternative facts that support his conclusions. It's exactly the kind of ideological thinking he claims to oppose.
And why it's under assault from like all quarters now as that underlying metaphysic disappears. Like you haven't had to be concerned with the mythological substrate in your lifetime in some sense because it was intact.
Yeah.
And so the universities could flourish and you had your freedom, remarkable freedom to pursue your scientific enterprise wherever you wanted, and people lauded you for it. Like that time is threatened. And seriously so. And I think it's partly because these metaphysical assumptions have now become questionable, and that's part of the reason that I'm attending to them. It's not because I don't admire the accuracy of quantum prediction, for example, or celebrate what Musk is doing with his capability of sending rockets to Mars. It's like more power to the technological enterprise. But you know what's happening in the universities. It's awful. And that's not a scientific problem. It's okay.
I agree about that.
Okay.
I think it's an interesting question why science emerged in Europe. I mean, and I'm not enough of a historian to know. It is even possible that Christianity did have something to do with that, and I wouldn't categorically deny that. But that doesn't in any way increase my trust in the validity of Christian propositions like the resurrection, the virgin birth, the miracles, and Jesus is the Son of God. Christianity may have had some kind of historical facilitating effect that led to the Renaissance, that led to the scientific revolution, and that would be a very interesting historical analysis, but it doesn't bear upon the truth of the propositions of the Christian religion.
Even if Christianity historically contributed to scientific development, which is debatable, that tells us nothing about whether Christian supernatural claims are actually true. This is basic logic that any undergraduate philosophy student should understand. But Peterson can't acknowledge this obvious point because his entire intellectual project depends on conflating Christianity's cultural influence with its factual accuracy. He wants to claim that Christian stories are true in some deep sense that transcends mere factual correspondence with reality. This is pure postmodern relativism, the idea that truth is whatever serves useful social or psychological functions rather than what corresponds to objective reality. The irony is staggering. Peterson built his career attacking postmodern academics for exactly this kind of relativistic thinking about truth. But when it comes to his own religious beliefs, he deploys the same relativistic arguments he claims to despise. Christian stories aren't true or false, they're methodologically significant. Religious claims don't need to correspond to reality, they just need to serve cultural functions. What we've witnessed in this exchange isn't just intellectual evasion, it's the real-time psychological collapse of a man whose entire identity is built on maintaining incompatible self-images and income streams. Peterson has created a business model that depends on appealing to mutually exclusive audiences while avoiding any position that could be clearly evaluated or criticized. The financial incentives are obvious and pathetic. Peterson makes millions of dollars by marketing himself as both a defender of Christian civilization and a rational intellectual who's too sophisticated to believe in supernatural fairy tales. The moment he gives a straight answer about whether he believes Jesus was born of a virgin, he loses half his audience and half his income. So instead of intellectual honesty, we get elaborate performances designed to make evasion look like profundity. But the psychological dynamics are even more revealing. Peterson has constructed his entire self-concept around being a profound thinker who sees patterns and connections that lesser minds miss. When confronted with simple questions that would expose the contradictions in his worldview, he can't simply admit ignorance or uncertainty because that would threaten his grandiose self-image as a genius. So Peterson has developed elaborate psychological defense mechanisms that protect both his income and his narcissistic self-concept simultaneously. He's convinced himself that his inability to answer straightforward questions represents intellectual sophistication rather than intellectual cowardice. The virgin birth question is particularly devastating because it's the perfect test of Peterson's intellectual honesty. It requires no advanced degrees or specialized knowledge to understand. Either Peterson believes a woman conceived a child without sexual intercourse, or he doesn't. His theatrical inability to answer this simple question reveals someone who has built his career on sophisticated-sounding nonsense designed to avoid accountability. But Peterson's evasiveness serves a deeper psychological function for his audience. His followers don't want clear answers because clear answers can be evaluated and potentially rejected. What they want is permission to feel intellectually sophisticated while avoiding the hard work of thinking clearly about reality. Peterson provides exactly this service. He makes evasion and confusion feel like wisdom and depth. Peterson has probably convinced himself that his grift represents genuine intellectual work. In his mind, he's not avoiding difficult questions to protect his income, he's operating on such a sophisticated level that simple questions about factual reality are beneath him. This self-deception allows him to maintain his grandiose self-image while engaging in fundamentally dishonest intellectual practices. The broader implications are disturbing. Peterson represents a new model of intellectual grifting that's perfectly adapted to the digital age. Rather than taking clear positions that can be evaluated, he specializes in sophisticated-sounding evasions that make his audience feel smart while keeping them intellectually powerless. It's the commodification of confusion masquerading as the pursuit of wisdom. His followers see someone bravely defending traditional values against secular nihilism. But what they're actually witnessing is someone who's too financially and psychologically invested in his own mythology to engage honestly with basic questions about reality. Peterson's performance in this debate reveals why he's become such a polarizing figure. His critics see right through the elaborate performance to the financial and psychological motivations underneath. But his supporters have been trained to interpret any criticism of Peterson as evidence of the critic's intellectual inferiority or ideological bias. The ultimate irony is that Peterson has become exactly what he claims to oppose, someone who uses sophisticated language to avoid taking responsibility for clear positions that could be evaluated and criticized. The only difference is that his relativism serves his personal brand rather than progressive politics. But the intellectual dishonesty is identical, and the long-term damage to serious discourse is just as destructive. Peterson's empire is built on exploiting people's desire to feel intellectually sophisticated without doing the hard work of intellectual development. He offers his audience permission to feel like deep thinkers while protecting them from any ideas that might challenge their existing beliefs or force them to confront uncomfortable realities. It's intellectual junk food, and the long-term consequences for his followers' capacity for genuine critical thinking are likely to be severe.